Let's discuss about Material UI. Material UI is a UI component library with components built using React. In fact, Material UI is the most popular UI component library in the React world. Before we go to Material UI's website, let us quickly discuss why this library is so popular. Material UI gives us pre-built components, and using pre-built components is one of the main advantages of front-end JavaScript development. Now, why is that? That is because it allows us to implement faster and also with better quality. We can implement faster because for most requirements, customizing Material UI's components is sufficient instead of starting from scratch with the div, span tags, etc. With Material UI, we are able to implement faster because instead of starting from scratch with HTML tags like div, span, etc., we can start with Material UI's components as the base and customize them as per our requirements. And for most requirements, that is usually sufficient. And that is why we are able to implement faster when we use Material UI library. And the second advantage is better quality. And that is because Material UI components already have a professional finish look. Next, we will be going to the Material UI website. And when you take a look at the components, you will understand what I mean by Material UI components already having a professional finish look. Next, let us go to Material UI's website, and the website's URL is material-ui.com. If you look at the description for Material UI, it says React components for faster and easier web development. And it goes on to say, build your own design system or start with Material Design. Let's click on Get Started link over here, and that takes us to the installation page under Getting Started. We will be installing Material UI as an NPM package, and we'll do an example where we will use a couple of components that Material UI library gives us, but we will be doing that later. What I want to do first is go through the list of components that Material UI gives us, because I think it is very important for us as React developers to know which components are available to us. So on the left hand side menu, click on components, and when we click on components, the menu expands and we can see a list of components listed under it. The first subheading is layout, and within layout we have a few components like box, container, grid, grid list, hidden. Let's click on container and let's see what it is. The description says the container centers your content horizontally, and it is one of the most basic layout elements. Next, let us take a look at the grid component, and the description for grid says that Material Design's responsive UI is based on a 12-column grid layout. If you scroll a bit further down under how it works, the documentation says that it uses CSS's flexible box module for high flexibility, and that there are two types of layout, containers and items. And it also says that there are 5 grid breakpoints: XS, SM, MD, LG, and XL. And the documentation also says that since the grid is based on CSS's Flexbox module, if we are not familiar with Flexbox, then it asks us to go to this link over here and read upon Flexbox. So the point to note here is that the grid component is based on CSS's Flexbox module. So we'll have to understand Flexbox in order to understand the grid component in the Material UI library. And if we scroll a bit further down, there is a section about spacing, and the documentation says that the grid focuses on consistent spacing widths rather than column width. And it also says that the spacing property is an integer between 0 and 10 inclusive. And it also mentions 8px over here. So if we specify spacing equals 2 over here like this, that means we are saying we want 2 into 8px, which is 16px, as the gap between the grid items. Let me mention this once again. We specify the spacing property as an integer whose value is between 0 and 10, and each unit of spacing is usually 8px. So for example, if we specify spacing equals 2, that means there will be a gap of 2 into 8px, which is 16px between the grid items. Here we have an example. Here we can see spacing in action. Currently the value that is selected is 2, and so we have 2 into 8px, which is 16px, as the gap between these grid items. If you click on 1, for example, over here, then you can see that the space between the grid items has decreased now. Since we have specified a spacing value of 1, the space between the grid items over here is now 1 into 8px, which is 8px. Let's select 4 now, and let's see what happens. As you can see here, the space between the grid items has increased, and like we have been calculating, the space is now 4 times 8px, which is 32px. So 32px is the space between the grid items. And spacing is important because the grid focuses on consistent spacing widths rather than column widths. Now let us move on to the next subsection, which is inputs, and let's quickly take a look at the button component. So I'm going to click on the button component now, and the page for button component shows that we can have different types of buttons. For example, we can have contain buttons, which look like this. As you can see here, these buttons look great, and this is what I meant earlier when I said that Material UI components have a professional finish look. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see that we can have text buttons as well, which look like this. And if we scroll down a little bit further, we can see that we can have something called outline buttons, which look like this. Using the size property, we can have different sizes of these buttons, and we can also have buttons with icons and labels. As you can see here, these buttons have icons and labels within them. So as we have seen here, the button component has many variations, and you will find that many of Material UI components have variations like this. And usually we use the variant prop to specify which variant we want to use. For example, here we have specified the value contained for the variant prop because this code wants to show contained buttons. And similarly, if we want these outlined buttons, then you have to specify the value outlined for the variant prop. So the point to remember is that many of the Material UI components have this prop called variant, where we can specify which variation of the component we want to use. Before continuing to look at the other components, let us quickly discuss how to do examples with the Material UI components. If you notice under the examples, usually you will find these icons, and if you hover over these icons, the first icon says that show the full source code. If you click on that, we are shown the entire source code of the example. That means we are shown the source code for this example over here. So we can go through this source code over here to better understand it. Now let us take a look at the second icon. If you hover over the second icon, it says edit in Code Sandbox. So let's click on that. And when we click on that, what happens is that the example is opened in codesandbox.io. Codesandbox.io is similar to codepen.io, which we had used while discussing JavaScript examples. Let me zoom in just a little bit. Let's look at how to use this environment. On the left, we have files over here. And as you can see here, the file that is open is index.js right now, which is this file over here. Let us click on demo.js and open it. Now we have demo.js open, which has the example code. By the way, below the files section over here, we have the dependencies section also, and we can add dependencies using this text box over here. As you can see here, the dependencies that have been added are React, React DOM, Material UI, etc. If we click on this icon over here, this entire section will be hidden so that we will have more real estate for our demo.js file over here. So let's do that. So I'm going to click on the icon over here now, and as you can see here, that got hidden. If you need that back, just click on it again and it will come back. Let's hide it for now. Let me adjust this a little bit. And what we can do here is we can modify the code over here, and we can see the output change accordingly over here. For example, let us change the label over here from default to new label. So let me type new label over here, and as you can see here, the label of this button has changed from default to new label. Let's modify one more label. Let's modify this label to say new primary label. And as you can see here, our change has been reflected over here. The label of this button has been changed from primary to new primary label. So this is one very nice way in which we can practice the Material UI examples. You will find these icons below every Material UI example that is shown on this website. So you can look at the source code, or you can click on the edit icon over here and go to codesandbox.io and modify and play with the code. Now let us continue looking at the other components.